Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another tutorial. We're going to be looking at Qtractor and Carla again today, but we're going to be dealing with a particular instrument library that I've been playing around with. This is the Virtual Playing Orchestra, VPO. I'd heard about this library, and I'd run into it online, and I had experimented very vaguely with it, briefly with it in Linux Sampler. But I didn't really dig too deeply until just recently here. I created an arrangement just for the brass samples. Brass samples are very, very hard to get to sound realistic, mostly because brass samples are often very limited. They don't have the full dynamic range of the instrument. Brass instruments, unlike most of the other wind instruments and certainly the string instruments, have a very drastically different sound from their loudest volumes to their softest volumes. They almost sound like completely different instruments when you are performing on them at their extreme volumes, extreme dynamics, and also at their extreme registers. And because of that, plus the added articulations that you can play on them, different tonguings and articulations, because of that, they're very, very hard to put into a virtual orchestra project without having many, many different layers of articulations and having libraries that cover all of the bases. And even then, it's hard to find libraries that are compatible with each other that sound similar enough as if they were in the same room, in the same space when they were recorded, same kind of timbre to them. So that being said, I thought, well, I would really give this thing a whirl and go right for the brass instruments, make a brass arrangement, and try to really flex the muscles of it and see how close we can get to realistic. And I was actually quite surprised at how well it came out. You can listen to that track. I'm not going to play it here, but I have a link there in the description where you can go listen to that. I just want to break this down and talk briefly about what these samples are, how they can be used, and why they're a really nice way to work around, particularly maybe the brass instruments. Of course, the VPO library covers the full gamut of the orchestra. However, as I said, the brass ones are the ones that tend to need the most layers and articulations. And if we can do what we can do with 5 layers, 5 different channels with one, then we're definitely ahead of the game. And that's what I tried to do here. So very briefly, before we get into this project, I just want to point you to a few different locations here. This is the website for the VPO, virtualplaying.com. You can download it here. It's a pretty simple, straightforward website. It's not terribly flashy. It's just a personal website that the creator keeps. It was recently updated March 1st with a few changes made to the SFZs. This is an SFZ sample library, so not an SF2, not a sound font, but SFZ, which means that if you're on Linux, like I am, you're going to need to be able to play SFZ. They can be played in Linux Sampler. However, there is a problem in the Linux Sampler playback, in that the samples don't necessarily get controlled entirely, completely the way they were intended by the controllers on your MIDI keyboard. So before we get into that, there is a workaround for that. Let me show you briefly where this comes from, though, where these samples come from. This is really a collection of a wide variety of open source, freely available samples that the creator, I think it's Paul Battersby, put together. I think that's who did it. And he drew from a number of different sources. Before I get into that, though, I want to point you to another sample library. This is the Vercillion Studios Virtual Instruments, and this is their Chamber Orchestra Community Edition. They have a couple of paid sample libraries, but this one is free, and it is open source. It is available for people to change and edit any way that they please and use. And this is a core element, I believe, in the VPO sample library. It's also a core element in this one, which is another one I've run into, the Alpine project. Same kind of idea. It's made up of public domain sources, things that are open source and public domain. And this is actually a contact instrument. So if you're on a Windows machine, or if you're on an Apple platform and you are using Contact Player, you can use this inside of your Contact playback engine. Nonetheless, they're really the same samples, very, very similar set. There may be subtle differences, but most, I think, of the sources are the same. And I know this because it's interesting. On the Vercillion Studios, they seem to have an attitude for open source here, because they have linked to similar projects that are using similar sources. So here is the vanilla SFZ version. This is not what we're going to hear, though, in a minute. I'll probably cover this on another tutorial, but this is their library. And then down below that, they give you links to other libraries that are using the same sound. So Big Cat's VSTI version, so this is a VSTI instrument, and then another one, a chamber orchestra, which is for Contact, from the same maker. And then down here we have Virtual Playing Orchestra, and you'll note that this is a really big set. This has a lot of instruments in it from a number of different sources besides the Vercillion Chamber Orchestra. So it's based on this VSCO2, but it's also based on the Sonatina sound font collection, which is one that we've talked about before, a very good sound font collection. The No Budget Orchestra, University of Iowa, is also something that a lot of these other sample libraries are based on, these open source ones. This is a set of sounds that were recorded at the University of Iowa over the last, 20 years, long period of time. And they've made a bunch of samples. I don't know what the original purpose was for, but they're excellent samples from which you can create instruments, and a number of people have done that. So that's another great source. And then other sample sets, as they explain here. So a variety of different sample sets have been put together, processed, and then put together into a library. This is probably the biggest one of all the ones on the page here. It says here that in this version you need a sampler that can open SFZ files. You can use Sforzando for this, which is available here, and that website is here. This is the Sforzando player. This is actually what I used. Now, Sforzando is a VSTI. It's a virtual instrument, a VST instrument, and last tutorial I gave on this subject, I was bashing the VST route in Linux using Windows VSTs via the Wine compatibility layer. I have to eat my words on this because I found that the Sforzando player works pretty well, I think, provided that you're running on real-time kernel, which I am on Ubuntu Studio, and I think also provided that you're using a very stable rendition of Carla and Wine. And I am using the binary of Carla. That's something I talked about in a previous tutorial, that the binary release seems to be a little bit more stable than the KX Studio builds, which is what I'm using. I'm using the binary. I'm also using the app image of Qtractor. I find that the portable versions of these programs in Linux seem to be a lot more stable than the repository installations. So I'm using those, plus, again, the real-time kernel in Ubuntu Studio, and everything seems to work pretty well. I was actually quite surprised. Now, if you don't have that, on the Virtual Playing Orchestra, they do explain that you can use, if I find the download here, here's the download page. I found that you can use Linux Sampler. However, they have a little bit of a thing here. Let me see if I can find it. There's an explanation. If I can find here, they explain that supported SFZ players. This library is known to work with the following SFZ players. It may work with others, but I don't know. If I'm told it works with others, I'll list them here. Sforzando, Garritan Aria Player, which is what Sforzando is based on, Linux Sampler, and you'll notice that it's got a little asterisk next to it, and also MuseScore. And I don't know the conditions under which it can work in MuseScore, if it has to be in Windows or not. I haven't tried to do that. My feeling on that is that MuseScore uses the controllers a little bit differently, so it's probably not beneficial for a realistic sound to use the sample set in MuseScore. better to, I think, export your MIDI data from MuseScore and then sequence that in a digital audio workstation from there. So that's what I do. Linux Sampler, let's look at what this little thing says. So with Linux Sampler, in key switch patches, default selection of a sound, typically sustained, doesn't work. The key switch key may be pressed before any sound will play. That's no big deal. So what it's telling you is that if you're using the key switch patches, you want to make sure that you indicate the patch that you're using prior to the actuation of those notes. So there is no default setting for sustain when using Linux Sampler. Fine. Also, patches that use the mod wheel, and this is very, very important for the performance samples, and I'll talk about that in a moment, may not work properly since Linux Sampler apparently doesn't permit any controller to control more than one parameter at a time. Indeed, that is true. I've been told that editing the SFZ files and replacing gain CC1 with volume on CC1 solves the problem, thanks to this person here, Kevin Haynes. I can confirm that this does work. I went through the SFZ files on all of my performance files, and I changed, what I did is I just did a Control F function in a text editor, searching for gain CC1. Every time I found one, I overwrote that, copied and pasted in volume on CC1. So I replaced all of those, and I did confirm, this is a while back, that what it will do is it will make the mod wheel function for the coarse volume, and the coarse volume will control that aspect of the sound font layer. So that worked very well for getting volume contrast through the cross-faded dynamics, which is very important to the brass sounds. And also it retained the articulations, which are handled by the velocity settings. So this does work. Now, that being said, this isn't really the best way to fly. You want to probably use it as is in an SFZ player if you can. So I found that this works fine, and until Sforzando stops working in Carla or stops working in Wine, I'll probably do this, and then I've saved aside a copy with these changes in it that I can use in Linux Sampler later if I really need to. I also found that Carla was able to handle this very, very well. I loaded in, let's see here, I've got one, so these orange kind of looking metallic modules are the Sforzando players. You can see I opened this up here. It runs very well. I did find that usually when opening Carla, after saving, it will fail to load the first one or two of these, and you just close Carla and open it up again, then they load back in. It does not crash. It runs very well. Not only that, but it will play all of them back. But every one of these orange spots and also these light gray ones is an instance of Sforzando. So that's quite a few VSTIs and SFZs running in here, which is pretty neat. So I have 13 different instances of that instrument and 13 different SFZs running all at one time. So here's what it does. I can kind of demonstrate what the benefits are very quickly. If I select a horns over here, so I have the horn patch selected, and I hit my keyboard, MIDI keyboard, I can play it, and I have my mod wheel all the way down. I don't know if you can hear this, but it's a very, very soft horn. Now, if I hit the key hard, it will give a very high velocity to the note and give it a harder attack, even though it's soft. So you can play with a heavy attack at a soft volume. That is something you can do on a wind instrument, particularly on a brass instrument. It makes a very different sound than if you were playing softly with a soft attack at a low volume. So let me try that very quickly. So I'm going to press the key very softly, and you can see how the sound sneaks in. That's kind of a high register. Let me move down here. So that's soft, which is a low velocity. This is hard, high velocity, but very soft volume. Now, listen to this. If I hold down the note and I move my mod wheel, it will actually crossfade into another layer of samples, which is a louder dynamic, gives you more of a brassy edge to it. That's one horn. This is two horns down here. Listen to this, same note. So that's just by moving my mod wheel. So you can do all kinds of interesting dynamic effects just using two controls, velocity, note velocity, and the mod wheel. Now, the way I did that in Qtractor, if we go into one of these tracks, you'll see here that my note velocity is indicated here. Now, when the velocity is high, it's giving me a heavier, more stark attack. But unless my mod wheel is high, my coarse modulation is set high, it won't give me that edgy, brassy sound. So what you do is you have a combination between the two, between your mod wheel and your velocity settings. You can get a wide variety of articulations. That means that you can play short and staccato, and loud and soft, and every combination therein, and long and legato, just by combining these two different things. So very quickly, let me just play back a sample of this, and you can kind of hear what's going on. I'll just jump ahead here in my project, and we'll hit play. So that's just one instrument per layer. There's only one instrument on each one of these channels. Between the velocity and the mod wheel, we get a wide variety of articulation. So I'm quite impressed with this. Now, if I am going to give it some criticisms, I'll give it this one. On the solo instruments, I'll take the solo trumpet here very quickly. Here's the trumpet sound. This is soft, low on the mod wheel, so soft dynamic. This is a light articulation. That sounds great. Now, two things. That's as loud as it gets. I find that the maximum dynamic is probably just shy of what these instruments really can do, these solo ones. That just has to do with the samples that they're using. My guess is that they probably took these from the University of Iowa sample set. Which the fortissimo dynamics on those instruments are not quite, I think, at the maximum dynamic that a player really can play. There were students probably performing that. Very good samples, but I think they're just a little bit shy. Now, it's less obvious on the double instrument, so this is two trumpets, similar kind of thing here. They get a lot more brassy, and that's probably because there's a combination of two samples together. Likewise, I can say the same thing about the heavy articulation. So here's the double. That's a very good, rock solid fortissimo accent. But on the single instrument, it's really more like a forte or a good solid mezzo forte. So I wish, and that seems to be pretty universal for all of the solo instruments. The trombone is pretty good, but the trumpet, the horn, the bass trombone, the tuba, I think they're lacking a little bit on that upper dynamic level, both in their articulation velocity ability and in the mod wheel layering. I think there's one more. I think they can get closer to the edge. So that's my only really gripe there. It's not that noticeable, and actually what you can do is you can take an instrument and just EQ it a little bit to give a little bit more of a shine, a little bit more of an edge, and you get a little bit closer, just a step closer to that brassiness. So just bring up the highs on the instrument, and that helps out a little bit. Otherwise, these are very, very impressive samples, nice sample set. And this, it's not perfect. It's not, perfectly realistic, but it's pretty close. I mean, this is really good for free. If these instruments were buried inside of an orchestration, I think they would be completely passable as a real thing, given enough time. And actually, given enough time just on this MIDI sequence, you probably could make it even better. And that's to say nothing of adding a few extra articulations from some other sound fonts or other sample sets, free ones, open source ones, to augment this even further. Really, really impressed with VPO. A couple things about orchestration and also rather mixing here. I decided to run all of my mixing inside of Carla, and the reason for that was it's kind of like running all of my mixing in LMMS, which is something I like to do when I was running LMMS off of Carla, and I still do, or off of Qtractor, and I still do that occasionally. There's a lot more power in LMMS to do mixing. It's similar in Carla. Carla is very stable when I'm using this binary. So what I did is I did all of my mixing in here, and I just used my effects channels as my final mixing points. So what I did is I have, for my trumpets, I have a reverb that's just for them. And this is just a very basic reverb. And I use this to kind of give a location for the instrument. So I have my blend set up, but I have the dampening set up very high, so it's kind of a drier reverb. It just gives it a location and space. And then I run these reverbs out. I check my levels going in, make sure that my levels aren't peaking, and I can change that on my instruments and then my over here. That also, by the way, that also frees up my MIDI faders because I'm using the coarse modulation wheel to affect dynamics. I can use my faders here separately and static just to do mixing. So I can mix from here into Carla, and I can use my mixing console quite genuinely in there. Nonetheless, if you take a look inside of Carla, what I'm doing is I'm mixing all of these reverbs, these red ones, down to my final calf reverb. So if you want to look at my Patchbay, you can kind of see what this looks like here. If I just zoom out very quickly, I have all of my simple MIDI channels coming out. I'm using a different MIDI filter, by the way. Last time I talked about another MIDI filter. There's a simpler one made by the same maker that has just a simple channel, MIDI simple channel filter. You can find that one. It's got a single parameter on there, which is a lot more flexible, and it requires less clicking and moving of settings. So I have a MIDI channel designated to each one of these in the Patchbay to filter down. Unfortunately, you have to do that in Carla until they change that so that instruments have that filter built in. And then it goes out to the instruments, and the instruments go to their reverbs, and then the reverbs go to the final reverb, and then that goes out to a couple of effects here. I've got an EQ, I've got a compressor, and then that runs out to my audio output. Now, the reason why this is beneficial is that this allows me then inside of Qtractor to have only one audio input from Carla. So I just have my return audio coming back to a return bus that then goes to the master. I could bring it right back to the master, but I put this buffer in here in case I wanted to do any more effects inside of Qtractor. I'm able to layer those up and then have that run to the master, and then I can mix down, bounce out from my master whenever I'm ready. But anyway, this is really good because Carla does not necessarily connect persistently to Qtractor session to session. It does sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. And the nice thing about doing it this way, doing most of my mixing, effects mixing in Carla, which again is more stable anyway, it's nice that I only have one input to connect. So if it doesn't persist and doesn't connect right, it's no big deal. All I have to do is connect my Carla to my return connect my MIDI inside of Carla's Patchbay, and then I'm good to go. It's not a real big deal. So I can just consistently do this in my projects, and I don't really have to worry about saving sessions and making a bunch of connections like you do with Linux Sampler, or like you would do with, especially like you would do with LMMS. So the other thing, again, I don't know if you noticed, is that I played all of those back and they all played in real time and there wasn't even a hiccup. So Carla just seems to be a lot more stable than Linux Sampler right now. The Linux Sampler has some issues where it starts dropping MIDI channels even if you're using fewer than what a bus is maxed out at, which is 16. It just doesn't seem, it chokes on all the data. So Carla does not seem to be doing that right now, especially given the fact that it's playing bigger samples at a higher bit rate from WAV files through these SFZs rather than SF2s. So anyway, just wanted to share that with you, and hopefully we'll look more and more at this kind of a setup and integrating these bigger libraries, these SFZ libraries, via this method in the future. So hopefully you enjoyed this and you learned something, and I wish you the best of luck with this and happy mixing.